In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captains how to fight
guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Arma verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cry, Candide. I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
she was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Hi. Here we go, our second hour on Dante. I'm not sure where we are now in our Living Lit series. I think we're at, or whatever. We'll do our second hour on Dante. I enjoyed our conversation last time very much. As I remember at the end of the last hour, I had to leap between the debate between cultural relativism on the one hand, as I remember, and the need to read Dante as a modern on the other. It was a very lively discussion. You guys had a lot of energy with Dante, and I'm delighted that Dante can elicit that kind of response even 600 or 700 years later. Let's start as we usually do with questions. What kind of questions do you want to ask about Inferno?
Well, I want to know the author's mindset when he wrote this. This is so complicated and it calls for so many types of punishment. Was he a tormented soul himself, or just vindictive where people were concerned, or what?
Oh boy, that's a tough question to answer. I don't. He was tormented politically, to be sure. Yeah. To be sure, I think the journey that Dante the Pilgrim makes, as you guys made it eminently clear last time, is a kind of essential human journey. So I don't think he needed to be particularly tortured to make that. Is he a vindictive person? Yes, against his political enemies, he most assuredly is. The politics of his day were quite intense. You can see that. You can see the depth of feeling, can't you, when he puts some of his political enemies in hell. He's really quite almost vicious in his treatment of them. And remind yourselves that this is taking place in the year 1300, even though it's being written decades later. Or a decade and a half later anyway, those old animosities have not eased with the passage of time. And indeed, I'd suggest to you they've done just the opposite. The passage of time has made it even more painful for Dante, who is, of course, remind yourself always that he's 20 years in exile from Florence, and all that Florence means to him. He had to move from a state to a state, essentially, for 20 years, seeking patronage from noble families who would take him in, and this would allow him to write. So your question's a very good one. This does seem, doesn't it, a very personal epic. Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's really one of the first of those in the Western culture, if you think about it. Everything you've read up to now, you do not find the author as a player in the narrative or the drama that is being presented. Here, he very carefully names his narrator, names his pilgrim, Dante, which is very, very interesting. He uses a first person. This is a rather modern idea, quite frankly, the author in the work. You don't see that in the classical world very much.
And it's an autobiography, really.
It works on so many different levels. In a letter to Grande della Scala, and please don't write this in your notebooks, but he was just one of his patrons. He wrote a letter to this patron, telling the patron how he wished the work to be read. And in that letter, he sketches out the difference between the literal and the allegorical. But he talks about it being read on the literal level, the moral level, the allegorical level, the anagogical level, the biographical level, and he wants you doing all of that simultaneously. He says, in essence, there is more here than meets the ear, which you understand. We talked about last time, didn't we, allegory, and how allegory works as a kind of metaphor backwards. So, Valeria, you're right. There is an autobiographical level here, to be sure. Yeah.
My question is very similar to the one about historical context.
Yeah.
Was he drawing on traditions that were prevalent in the culture when he was describing the punishments, or was this strictly his genius?
Good question. Much of it is his genius. Much of it is his architecture. Obviously, there existed the kind of stuff that we still think of. If I ask you hell, you'll answer me with the cartoon conception, won't you? The first thing that's going to hit you is you're going to say is fire, right? I mean, it's almost impossible for you not to say that. There was some of that in the day, but it was the notion of fire in that tradition worked two ways. It was both a punishment, but it was also a purgative, so, yeah. So your question's a good one. Much of this is Dante's own, yeah. It's his invention, and it becomes a kind of standard after his time.
I was wondering, with all these sins that he mentioned, were those sins recognized by the church of that time, or did he invent some of these sins himself?
Yeah, no, he didn't invent the sins. The sins were in the air. Even the organization of hell was in the air. You'll remember Canto 11. I'll remind you of Canto 11. If you need to root yourself in the theological logic of the arrangement of hell, and we have a nice, if you look up on the monitor, you can see a nice graphic here showing the bottom of hell, the pit of hell. As we've said, down at the very bottom are the intellectual sins, the sins that, as I was talking to you last time about the great chain of being, those qualities of the human being that are divine. That's the divinity in us. It's the thing that has given us our dignity for centuries, is that notion that we have an intellect, that we have reason, that we share with the divinity. And that use of the reason, of course, is twisted in hell. And, of course, at the very top of hell we talked about is the sins of incontinence. These are sins, they begin as sins of mutuality, you'll remember, with Paolo and Francesca. Then we move to gluttons as the next level down. No more mutuality. You notice that? They're cut off from all community. And then we move down one more to the wrathful and sullen. And now community is restored, but what's the quality of that community? It's constant warfare, going against one another. So the scheme is quite traditional, actually, in terms of the arrangement of sins. So as you move down, remember that handout I gave you on the Thomistic soul, as you move down, you're moving higher in terms of human power. Yeah. Yeah. It's Thomas, I should tell you, it's Thomas Aquinas on Aristotle that kind of gives this, what do we want to call it, a theology? I guess we do in a way, yeah, kind of, or at least what the Renaissance came to call a faculty psychology, that is the powers of the human being arranged hierarchically with intellect and reason at the top and passion at the bottom. You got to watch out for appetite. So I'm quite serious about that. They really did. You've got to keep it in check. See that? If you think about it, Paolo and Francesca really didn't perform any kind of aggressively active sin, did they? What they did was kind of relax the intellect. You with me on that? They relaxed the intellect, and in dropping their guard. This is what I think makes them so sympathetic, because boy, do we know this one, don't we? In dropping their guard, in giving in to the moment, in refusing to exercise reason's, the head's, right control of the heart, they have sinned. And Francesca just does it wonderfully. You remember Mr. Baranski last time talking about what a master rhetorician Francesca is. She blames it on the book. She blames it on the time, right? She blames it on this. She blames it on that. And she uses a wonderful circumlocution. Rather than talk about what they actually did, she said it was, he gave me a kiss, and we know where it led.
Does Dante have more sympathy for Francesca and Paolo because it's a shared sin?
Yeah, that's a good question. That sin comes closest to what to one of the gifts of the divinity, which is the gift of love. It is frequently confused. Any of you have teenagers or had teenagers? You know? I mean, it becomes real important that you make distinctions here between love and lust. It's sometimes lost on those who do not have a refined sense of reason. They're frequently confused. So I think it's really more that, you know. I hope you didn't get from my last class when I suggested to you that Dante was not a wonderfully faithful husband while 20 years in exile. I hope you didn't leave here. I worried about that as I drove home, frankly, that you go out of here thinking that Dante was some kind of lascivious lout and had, you know, and was sympathetic to Paolo and Francesca because of reflections of self. I think probably not. What's remarkable about Dante, and don't ever forget this, is unlike so many people midway through life's journey, he recognizes he's in a dark wood. That's so easily overlooked as you read this epic. You know, you take as a given that we all discover we're lost in a dark wood. That's simply nonsense, isn't it? Most people go through vaguely aware, perhaps, of being in a dark wood, but do not have the kind of consciousness nor resolve to get themselves out of it. And that's what Dante has, and he's to be applauded for that.
I was going to say before that I find criticism with all the naming of names. I just don't think it's necessary. I mean, it's a wonderful piece, and we have just scratched the surface, of course. But it's almost as if he's expurging himself. It's kind of a get even thing. I just think it takes a little bit away from the classicism and the universality of the poem. I just don't think it's all those people are necessary.
You're speaking for generations of readers. No, I'm quite serious. Yeah. This has always been said about Dante, and for many modern readers, it's a little off-putting because there does seem to be an arrogance to it that is quite remarkable. But of course, any kind of judgment in eternal terms by any human being is arrogant by definition, from my point of view, you know. So I understand what you're saying, and yes, there does seem to be a little. Would you go so far as to say he seems a little mean-spirited?
It's overkill.
Yeah, I understand.
For his purposes, not for 20th century America.
Well, exactly, and he's writing against the backdrop of eternal judgment. So he would defend himself, of course, by saying that these people were indeed guilty of these things, and because they were guilty of these things, this is where they're going to go. If they happen to be alive while he writes this, it's a very interesting warning for these people to perhaps examine their own souls and perhaps think about repentance, because you understand the only way, if you're alive, you can avoid that fate is to be contrite in the Christian sense of that term, or in the medieval Catholic sense of that term, which means that you must confess. What's also marvelous, if I can go on this, what's just marvelous here that you might miss if it's not pointed out to you, what is the first act that these damned souls do when they arrive in hell? They have to see Minos, right? Remember Minos, who assigns them? And what do they do? They confess. Don't miss the irony here. They're not asked to do it. I can see light bulbs going on all over the studio. It's really quite remarkable, isn't it? Their first act when they come to be judged, to be assigned a place in hell, is to freely, of their own will, confess what they've done. Who assigns them to the level of hell? Not Minos. I mean, Minos is kind of like a judge who is forced to give sentences based on the evidence presented. There's no act of judgment on Minos' part. It's the sinner, him or herself, who does it. And don't miss the irony. Had they done that in life, they never would have been there. Yeah. And that's a very interesting idea. This is an idea we're going to come back to, believe it or not. It's a very Russian idea. When you read Crime and Punishment, and you'll see Dostoevsky's theory that you commit the crime, you seek the punishment. The criminal seeks his own punishment. It's the conscience haunting the criminal. If I can just conclude the idea, we talked last time about perhaps as modern readers we don't need to believe in a physical hell. You know, all of this can be read quite allegorically as a modern. What they are, from one point of view, is simply condemned to be themselves. And think about that. That's a marvelous concept, isn't it? They're condemned to be themselves for eternity. They get exactly what they want.
One of the reasons that they confess is because they assume an omnipotence. They know that this person that they meet knows everything, so if they don't come clean...
That's not implied in the narrative. Your question's obviously a good one, but that answer is not implied in the narrative.
That's not the reason that they do
no answer is implied in the narrative. They seem to feel a compulsion to confess. Now that's a very interesting idea, and it's a very complex idea. I would ask you to chew on that a while. It suggests that we all have within us, even the most fallen, have something inside that tells us right from wrong. Something inside that seeks a kind of purgation, whether it be through a confession or whether it be through a punishment. I don't know if you buy that or not. I mean, I just don't know if you believe that. That's really up to you. You're alone with that one. But, you know, do you believe that the sinner seeks a kind of punishment? Is there some, what are we going to call it, conscience? Is there some refined sense of social obligation, personal obligation, that demands that we confess?
You do see that.
You do see it all the time.
People
yeah.
who turn themselves in after years or just can't resist telling at least one person what they have done and then end up...
That need to confess, yes. That there are certain things you don't keep to yourself, even the worst things you feel a need to tell another.
Let me get back to that point of his mean-spiritedness and all. I don't think we can fathom the pain that he must have felt to be exiled from his beloved Florence.
Yes,
and he wanted
awful.
to get back. I mean, this, as you mentioned before, I think these animosities are going on today. You know, city-state against city-state. Well, we see what's happening in the Middle East. They don't forget these hostilities of spirit or whatever.
The modern Yugoslavia, what you're seeing in Bosnia right now.
If I can just answer that, though. Who is he to judge, though? You know, and this has become such a classical piece. Sure, the animosities are there, but he, you know, I don't mind. I think it's interesting to hear what an author says about another author. But he is making all these judgments on all these people, and you know, it just gets much.
He got to do that. That's why.
Talk about the power of the pen. Huh? Let me come over here, and then I'll.
Like I said, I mean, who is anybody to judge? I mean, you know, as you said. You know, if you're going to write something, you know, you get to choose. And I think in some ways we're kind of missing something. I really wonder when you write something, you might have some idea that it's going to endure substantially longer than you do. You might not. So, I mean, when you make a reference to someone, you know, it has all the references of the day in it. And I mean, sometimes I think that that's something that eludes us because we weren't there. And we can only... You know, we can only guess at how he felt or what kind of pain he was in, or I mean, how how the intended audience received it.
This would have been the popular press of the day.
Yes,
it may not have lived
well,
on.
for an educated audience, it's not for a mass audience to be sure, but for an educated audience. And let's be clear that he is not inventing this moral schema. I need to make that point again and again and again. This is not some moral schema that he has invented. This is the orthodoxy of the day. Now, the assigning of people to it is a whole different issue, yes. That's a whole different issue. But yes, his bitterness in exile was really quite real. I think I told you last time about his talking about only in exile do you taste the salt in another's bread. You know, and that salt is what? From his tears? You know, it's wonderfully ambiguous, isn't it? From his tears? Is it from somebody else's recipe? You're eating somebody else's recipe and it doesn't taste as good. Well, it's all these things, of course. He felt the pain of that
I brought a
exile.
book to show you because it's got Boccaccio and Petrarch.
Yeah.
So she was saying how authors feel about authors.
Yes, I can talk about
And it goes through T.S. Eliot. So
Yes,
it's
this is-
interesting to see other authors' views of what he's done.
Yeah, this is a marvelous little cheap paperback. I'll hold it up to the camera. I'm hoping you're getting this shot. I don't even know if this is in print anymore. I have this. Yeah, but what I'm saying is I don't know that you could buy this anymore. It may not be in print any longer. But it's a marvelous little critical introduction to Dante. And I should tell you that Dante, if I haven't told you already, Dante was immediately popular. One cannot even fathom what the motives were for people reading it. It has to be partly, will I see my neighbors, you know, sort of thing. But partly, of course, it was just the sheer language and imagination of the piece, and we really can't lose sight of that, you know. We have become such dolts when it comes to using our senses imaginatively because we live in a world now of virtual reality where even our sensual excitement is a kind of passive experience done by something else. Here it takes an active imagination, and in his day this was an extraordinary story, just on the narrative level.
Was Dante trying to rewrite the Bible? I mean, in the Bible they had all the begats, like he has the catalog of sinners that you object to all the names, and in a way, you know, he has all these levels of individuals and starting from the very depths to the high point.
Yeah.
And I think he must have had something in his mind to write something really great.
Yeah, it is encyclopedic in the sense of the Bible's treatment, but I think his model would not be so much biblical as it was epic, and I think I want to talk about that this morning a little bit. What's special about this epic? Because this really does redefine our concept of epic, and we'll want to talk about that. Boccaccio, let me give you a little critical history just so you know how this thing was received. Boccaccio did lectures on Dante, and indeed he wrote a life of Dante in the middle of the 14th century. So, you know, within 20 years, maybe 30 years of its publication of the Commedia, Dante is so well known throughout the Italian peninsula that Boccaccio is actually writing a life of him. Also wrote a series of lectures on Dante. Petrarch, you mentioned Petrarch as well. Petrarch, one of the great sonneteers. If you've never read Petrarch's sonnets to Laura, well, you've missed it for Valentine's Day, but for next Valentine's Day, by all means, read Petrarch's sonnets to Laura. Absolutely gorgeous. He likewise picks up the fame of Dante by referring to him frequently. Chaucer, you may remember, makes reference to Dante in the what is it? I think it's the Monk's Tale. So Dante has now spread to England. There's even rumor, you know, that Dante was at Oxford for a while. I'm quite serious. While he was in exile, he might have popped up at Oxford. Where all good people go, I suppose, at some time. Then in the 14th or 15th and 16th centuries, we start to get our first real doubts about Dante. There was concern mainly about his style and diction. You can see that even the Ciardi translation, which is so good, does mention bodily fluids and does mention body parts and things like that, which are not normally mentioned in polite conversation. And there was a little concern that Dante was a bit barbarous. They were the notion of decorum starts to become important in the early Renaissance, and Dante takes a beating for that as a result. When you move into the latter part of the 17th and into the 18th centuries, Dante's fame starts to starts to plummet. Voltaire absolutely hated him. We're going to read Candide, and Voltaire found him just barbarous. Just could not read the man. He went so far as to say that Dante will always remain famous because nobody reads him. you know that idea of there are certain classics that you just don't want to read. They're just famous, and I'm not going to read it. Yes, I'll bow before it, but don't ask me to read it, which is kind of funny. With the Romantics, just after Voltaire, with the Romantics, Dante comes back to the fore with Coleridge and people like that doing lectures on Dante. And then his fame remains secure through the 19th century. And then a remarkable thing happens in the 20th century. T.S. Eliot, whom you all know, does a series of lectures on Dante that become published, notes on Dante. And a kind of Dante Renaissance begins in the 1920s. And pretty much continues unabated to this day. He really exploded in the 60s and mid-70s. Dante did, where we were all kind of lost in a dark wood, if you will, and he remains to this day enormously popular. There's something about this guy that speaks to our age, just as much of many of the things we're reading do, and it might be instructive to think of those things. Yeah.
I think it's interesting when we compare what we've read before, where the gods were in control, and now we have people admitting that they did these things knowingly.
Yes, good for you. Isn't that a huge difference? Right. Yes. That what becomes essential in this moral schema, obviously, of Christianity, is individual responsibility. If there is not individual responsibility, then the whole notion of a rewards and punishments afterlife is nonsensical, right? And so that's a very good point you just made, that there are a few people in the Inferno who do try to shift responsibility off themselves onto something else, either another person or some force beyond human control. But obviously it's not persuasive in this moral schema because look where they are, which is very different from our age, if you'll think about this, because we have moved in a completely different direction now. We are obviously living in the 20th century in a post-Freudian world where we are very interested in the motives that lead to action. Frequently, the understanding of those motives changes the moral coloration of the act. You all understand my point. I mean, it's as contemporary, and this is going to date us if anybody's watching us on videotape in 5 years from now. I would only hope that would be true, but if it should be true, I mean, here we have the Menendez brothers, I mean, where you have the great cultural taboo, the killing of the parent, and not just the killing of the parent, but the brutal killing of the parent. And through the court, through the trial, one hears about past, one hears about motive, blah, 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 and the jury is unable to come to a moral conclusion. It's very interesting.
The product of your society.
Say again, I'm sorry.
They say they're the product of their society and that they're not at fault because they made me do it.
Well, that's the great cry, isn't it? Yes, of course. Yeah. Which we let's not be flippant. I mean, it is sometimes that is true, and to be sure. But it does become an easy hook upon which to hang your moral hat. Yeah.
Yes, and it seems to me that present people have reversed Dante's ranking of sin.
Oh, definitely. Oh, most assuredly.
Turned that scale upside down that we were looking at just a few minutes ago, and I don't know that they're right. I think that Dante's scale is more Christ-like when you realize that he found it easy to forgive, as Dante did those sins in Dante's first realm. The only times he lost his cool were with those who cheated the consumer, the dishonest merchants in the temple, and he said he was absolutely revolted by hypocrites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Other than that,
a uniquely human sin, isn't it?
Yes.
You'll see Milton do this as well in Paradise Lost. I can hear the guys in the control room going crazy. Once a class I mentioned Milton. Have you worked that out? I can't help myself. I'm sorry. I can't help myself. What circle do you want to put me in? Let's talk about that, Ahmad. What would you change? Let's talk about that, because there are some sinners here where today what do you want to do with the sullen?
Send them to a psychiatrist.
Yes, of course you do. Yeah. Good for you. Of course. Yes, of course. Yeah. They're depressed. Sure. Their wrath, you have the sullen and the wrathful. And the wrathfuls, they're angry, The angry of the wrathful is directed outward, The anger of the sullen is directed inward. What they need is a shrink. Yeah, we're not gonna put them in hell. For goodness sakes, can you imagine? Especially in our age? Wow, line up. Is there room? So yeah, most of us would forgive the sullen, wouldn't we? Yeah.
How about practicing divination and astrology? I mean, that's not a sin today.
Yeah, it takes such a variety of forms. That's always been around, of course. One always wants to know one's fate. And the heavy lesson, of course, of the Greek tragedies, as we read, is one's fate can only be known in retrospect. But that doesn't stop us from wanting to do it. Well, who are our modern diviners? I mean, we don't go to the Sibyl anymore. Maybe if you're Shirley MacLaine or something you do. But who do we go to? Who are our holy men or holy women?
Horoscope writers.
Yeah, sure, horoscope writers, yeah. But there's even more than that. I mean, physicians, right? We go to experts, to predict for us. We go to the scientists to tell us what's going to happen, Are we going to have earthquakes next year, It takes a variety of forms, yeah. Those earthquakes, once upon a time, were God's punishment. They still are in many places in China, for example, which is frequently racked by earthquakes. They will read, a good Chinese now will read that as wandering from the good Marxist-Leninist path, and it's a warning to get back on track. There were Russians, I got to tell you one other thing, this is so funny, there were Russians who were digging a mine. Last year, this was reported in the news, they were digging a coal mine in someplace in Central Asian province of Russia, and they decided that they had found the opening of hell. They could hear moans and screaming. They thought they had found the opening to the inferno. Isn't that marvelous? What other sins would we change? Let's talk about we become modern Dantes now, and we're going to write our own inferno. Let's first talk about who we'll take out of hell. Who are we going to take out of hell? And then we'll talk about who we'll put in.
Francesca and Paola.
You would?
Yeah.
You would? Wow. Even though...
I think the world is sympathetic to lovers, if it's a genuine love.
Always has been, yeah. But what if you're, what if it's your husband?
That's it.
You know? You know what I mean?
Another story.
Yeah.
Put him back.
Yeah.
Well, you got your own hell on earth now. You got
So much for moral relativism, right? You understand? Yeah, sure. Yes, it's sympathetic. And you're right, the world has always been sympathetic to lovers. Dante is sympathetic to these two. He swoons away. Look at the way he describes them. They're lovebirds. He surrounds them with the sound of shrieking starlings and things like that, but when we come to them, the sound is absolutely gorgeous. Read the lines out loud and listen to how beautiful they are, Not the ugly sounds that you see in the gluttony passage, It's a beautiful piece. Sure, we're sympathetic to it, but you still go to hell for what, for violating that, yeah.
Well, maybe the gluttonous you could take out because they're hurting mostly themselves. They're not interacting and hurting other people.
I'm glad you said that, because we do today seem to think that you can do whatever the hell you want to yourself, right? And it doesn't matter. Dante would disagree with that violently. Yeah.
It's your body, right?
Sure, if I want to be a glutton, hey, who am I hurting? Right?
But he would have thought it was the temple of the Holy Ghost.
Precisely.
And you can't defame it.
Precisely. And the act itself is allowing appetite to rule. And we have to, again, I want to come back to one of the things that makes Virgil such such a perfect guide for Dante, besides the fact that he's Italian, besides the fact that he sings about the celebration of Rome, besides the fact that he's an epic poet, is that he celebrated reason's triumph over appetite. Yeah, yeah. And so we can't let that happen. We're inclined, aren't we? Look at how we wrestle today with the notion of suicide. What a terribly complex issue that is. How often does your orthodoxy interfere with your humanity on this issue? Frequently is right. Yes, it frequently is. People in the throes of a terminal illness, experiencing pain beyond our ability to comprehend. It's the kind where even the magic cocktail that they give you, which is a mixture of heroin, you know, this, that, and the other thing, doesn't reach it. Every ounce of your compassion goes out for these people. And don't they have a right? Don't they have the owner's manual on their own lives? Don't they have the right to die with dignity? All of these sort of things. And
intellectually,
Dante says no.
No, and also I heard on public radio, not the whole article, so I can't say who did it and where the studies were, but the idea was that although we vote for issues like that with our minds, that people who find themselves in this position, and the doctor will say to them, now you need these for pain, but you're only supposed to take 2 at a time.
Oh, yes,
you understand,
right.
if you ever took 5 or 10 of these,
right.
that would be it. And they're capable of doing that.
Yeah.
That it's something like slightly fewer than 1% of men avail themselves of that option.
Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very
what they were
small.
saying. I wish I had heard it all.
Yeah.
And like 0.5% of women, that when it's their life, and they do not, apparently overwhelmingly, people do not vote with their actions when they're absolutely in that situation. As much as intellectually we think, well, we'd like to leave that door open for ourselves.
Yes, right. Yeah.
When the chips are down, people don't do it.
Yeah, it remains a remarkable social taboo to this day. And again, what one is destroying, of course, is the image of God. Here again is that dignity issue. You know, I think that's why we have such a hard time with suicide, isn't it? We'll put Tabby to sleep without a great deal of difficulty, even though Tabby has been a member of the family. You know how we are with pets, you know, or Rex the Wonder Dog or whatever has been a member of the family. We'll put them to sleep in our conscience. We'll feel bad about it, but we're not going to rack ourselves over it. But man, it's a little different. We don't dig a ditch in the backyard and throw grandma in, you know. I mean, I'm saying that in a silly way, but ask yourself, why? You know, and it's a qualitative difference in the life. Yes.
Well, I think that public radio interview was interesting from a variety of perspectives, because the other thing is to think, well, if my person can't tell me, surely if I were in that position, I would want to die, and so let's unplug them, or not unplug, but let's put them out of their misery. And what seems to be apparent is that if they were given a choice, they might or might not.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, and even the families who are taking care of terminally ill patients who could do that too, very, very easily, because they're usually so worn out. They're going 14 and 16 hours a day.
This is a terrible ordeal.
They're dispensing these medicines all the time.
Yeah.
But it is so hard for them, practically impossible, to kill hope.
Yeah.
There's always eternal hope.
There's always that miracle that happens for somebody once in 10 million, and why can't it be us?
Yeah. Yeah, we're definitely chipping away at the edges of Dante's moral schema. I mean, there really is no doubt about it, but we remain agonized in the process, and perhaps that says very good things about us. Yeah.
And then there's the motivation behind suicide.
It really matters.
Is it to alleviate horrible terminal pain, or is it to punish someone?
Good point. Very rarely do we want to judge an act morally without knowing exactly what the motivation is.
Because sometimes it's a very revengeful thing. Wait till I'm gone, and then they'll be sorry type of.
Sure. Thou shalt not kill, you know, and then I don't remember seeing a whole series of sub-paragraphs A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you know, but, you know, if my government tells me to kill, I kill. I have to kill. Or they might kill me.
Or go to Canada.
Well, that was not an option for me. I wish it had been.
That was my point, too, that you just made, that the person may wish to assist somebody to be eased out of their pain, but the counterpoint is that makes you the murderer.
Yeah, yeah. You know, we're just chipping away at one of these. We could continue on and on. Yeah.
If you wanted to chip away at another one, is
Yeah.
the opportunists. You know, in business, aren't we all opportunists?
How about the
in a way?
usurers? Oh, you know, the usurers in Dante's time, the usurers are those who are making money from money. You know, they're doing it in a paperweight. They're not, for Dante's time, your work was labor. And I mean that in the sense of, you know, a woman doesn't go into work at the end of 9 months. She goes into labor. It means pain. You know, it's associated with pain. We were told to dress and keep the garden, and we were told in Genesis that it would come from the sweat of our brow and all that sort of stuff. And the usurers just do a little paper shuffle, you know, and they make a considerable amount of money. Gosh, we've just been through the 80s. Right. Woo! It's a good thing Dante wasn't alive, huh? Boy, oh boy. That circle of hell would have been. And what we've done, which is very interesting to me, is rather than just chip away at this, we've turned this into a virtue. We've turned this into something that we might even tie with the spenders and wasters, the hoarders and wasters.
Well,
you
it
know?
seems that the 7 levels, the bottom ones have gone to the top, and the others have gone to the bottom.
Yeah, it's
it
very
just
interesting.
Does seem that way.
Yeah. Really?
Yeah, we are paying for it. Just the entire nation in debt, our national debt.
Well, see, that's what Dante would say. You know, if you think of his hell, again, not as a place of punishments in an afterlife, but as something that the sinner carries about with him or her, then he will suggest that that hell becomes the psychological state of the sinner. And it's not very hard, is it, to see that as you read through the Inferno. Yeah. So yeah, he would agree with you, I'm sure.
If I read it correctly, wasn't there one sin, the traitor, where he is tormented in hell, but he is still alive on earth?
Yes.
Did I read that correctly?
You sure did. Yeah, you sure did.
I mean,
yeah.
that is really very profound.
It's right on what I was just saying. Yes, it's exactly right. Yep. He carries his hell about with him, and it's also prepared for him when he dies. Yeah. That's a point that as moderns we really don't want to lose, because I think that's our connection to this epic. I think much of us have a very hard time with hell as an afterlife place. That's a difficult concept anymore, especially when you know where it's come from, you know, and you realize that well, it just seems very pre-scientific, doesn't it? But as a psychological state, that's one we connect with very, very easily, I think.
Well, I think probably in Dante's time there was one church, right?
Yes.
The heretics then, because we have so many divergent faiths, and nobody even questions anymore what someone else does or doesn't believe.
That's correct. Yeah, right. Yeah, we do
in
not.
fact, it's possible to change from a belief to another belief if it happens to be where your best friend goes, or more closer to home, or whatever reasons.
Yeah.
Reading through the Inferno, I kept thinking of Sartre's comment, hell is other
people. Yeah. No exit, right? Yes. Yeah. Yes and no, because clearly, you know, I don't mean to be flippant about this, but there are a lot of sinners down there who didn't need other people for their sins. There are mutually indulgent sins, to be sure, but there are also plenty of others. Gluttony, I suppose, the most obvious example. The heretics, Dante's heretics, who simply do not believe in an afterlife, and Dante puts them into hell. Others, please, as we rewrite this Inferno, this is kind of fun. How about the homosexuals? What do you want to do with them? You want to put them in hell? Seems pretty rough, doesn't it?
That's life in most of the world.
Sure.
So, why would they?
Sure. Yeah, we probably have a hard time with that. But of course we're wrestling with this, and it's not. This is another one that the society as a whole is very uneasy about. Very difficult issue.
We're on the verge of finding out that this is genetically caused. That it's, you know, and you can't condemn people for being born the way they are.
Boy, please, when we get into. When you get into...
I mean, you can't blame them for being schizophrenic, because that is genetically caused.
Once we put them to the torch. Yes, and now we discover its brain chemistry. Ooh, the sullen brain chemistry. You know, all you need to do is take a little pill.
That's the depression they're talking about. Yeah. Well, it's still frowned upon by some, I suppose, but it's been that way over past history, where
it's only recently that
they're just breaking through on that.
Look what we're doing here. This is very interesting to me. What's the modern metaphor for sin? We don't use the term sin anymore, do we?
No.
I mean, rarely in modern parlance as a society do we talk about sin. What have we replaced sin with?
Disease.
Good for you. Bingo, you did it. Yep. The new sin is disease, is precisely right. Whether it be physical or psychological, or as you point out, that line which we once thought was so, I don't know that we ever thought it was very simply demarcated, but clearly that line has blurred between the physical and the psychological. We have a whole new model upon which to view man. It's the disease model. The question then becomes the one of responsibility, and that gets you into really tricky ground, doesn't it? To what extent is the schizophrenic responsible for his or her schizophrenia? And I mean, you know, it's very hard to blame a schizophrenic for being schizophrenic, is it?
And then genetic testing that's coming along, and they've got a lot of moral dilemmas to deal with.
We sure do. We are in an age, clearly, we're transitional in so many ways, but this one, I think, is clear, that we have been in a kind of Dantean world, and while the strict model does not apply, the concept applies. We've just rechanged the language. We've played with the language as we chip around the edges. Yeah, it's fascinating to watch.
Where do we put politicians?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a time when we used to look at China and say, well, everything is graft.
Yeah.
But we're finding now that if you find a successful politician, he's got to be one who compromises successfully.
Politics is the art of the possible.
We never think of an honest man being in politics.
Yeah, right. Politics is compromised by definition. It's the art of the possible.
And the fact that we have accepted it as the way of life, where before, Honest Abe, Lincoln, you know, so we have done a lot of changing in our societal thinking about the people who run our country.
Yeah. Dante is particularly vicious with the grafters,
Mm-hmm.
and there's an obvious reason for that. Do you remember? That's what he was accused of. Yeah, exactly.
Accused,
and was
exiled on the basis of the accusation.
And was willing to stay in exile.
Yes.
Rather than admit to something he hadn't done. He insisted that he not be branded with that description. Well, I don't know, you know, you tell me what you want to do. I know what I want to do with politicians, but I can't say it in polite company. But which is not fair, you know, which is not fair. But sure, if people are abusing office for personal end, those grafters definitely are going to hell, you know. Don't forget that the state, I have to remind you again of the great chain of being concept that we've talked about. And do know, here's our, as we look up, you can see where Dante, if you look on your monitor, you can see where Dante puts the grafters and the false counselors and the falsifiers and the simoniacs, which is another kind of graft. You know, it's just an ecclesiastical graft, right? He puts them pretty far down, doesn't he? Down into that eighth circle, which is the Malabolge, the bad hole, or bad rut, or however that translates. They're very far down in the scheme of things. Don't forget too that they betray their crimes are not personal. They affect large groups of people as well. You know, their crime is particularly awful because it's not. We're more forgiving of those, as we did earlier, who are just hurting themselves. Here we're hurting the body politic. Listen to the word I just used there, the body politic, and I want you to hold on to that concept because it's operative in Hamlet. The body politic is poisoned in Hamlet, and it's the head of the body politic who is the king. You all with me? The leader is the head, the reason. As the reason rules the body, the head rules the body, or should rule the body. And so you see these folks in Malabolge are ones who were dirtying the head, as it were, and that's why they're down where they are. Yeah?
I think the reason we're having such difficulty deciding who to put in and take out is that we have done a lot of soul searching. It was better when there were these strict tenets and we knew
Yes.
exactly
Yeah, there's
what
very
black
little
was black, white was white, this was
Yeah.
right, this was wrong.
It was easier.
It was
yeah,
easier.
good for
Now
you, Barbara.
we're-
I'm not sure
we're-
it's better, but it
No,
was
we
easier.
were,
Yeah.
it was easier, and now we're having all these soul searching, and who among us can cast the first stone, and how do we know how we'd react as a politician or in any of these different circumstances?
Yes.
So we, in our own little bit of humanity, we feel compassion for these others. I don't know, it is a moral dilemma.
It really is a dilemma.
I think it puts us in a very stressful
yes.
Absolutely
living
true.
situation.
Yeah. The age of anxiety is the label that's used for the 20th century. And it's a fairly good label because the old models really are collapsing. It's not at all different from certain other revolutionary times. Let's see, Dante's universe, a nice Ptolemaic ordered universe where I think I've used this with you before. If I have, forgive me, but in Dante's time I could walk out on the beach at night. You all know that experience of walking out on the beach at night, walking along the beach at night, and I could look up at a star-filled sky and I could know my place in the cosmos. I could know that I was the divine representative on earth, right? That I had dominion over all, that as I looked up through the stars, it was a kind of staircase leading up to the top step, which was bathed in light. Have I used this metaphor with you before? All right, so I look up to the top step and it's bathed in light. I know that God is up there in the Empyrean. And as I look down the staircase, I can see it leading down to Adam and Eve. I know where I came from, you know, and then I know because of my nature, I rule the animals. I can do with them as I don't want to say damn well please, but you know what I mean. I have dominion over them. I have dominion over the earth. If I don't like the way a river is flowing and I need to move it over here, I just redirect it. I use engineering and I redirect the river because I have dominion over all of this. It's a very comforting kind of notion to know where you are, to know right and wrong, you know, to know that someone's watching, and to know that ultimately the good will be rewarded and the evil will be punished, because as I look about me, I know that ain't happening here, you know. I know too many good people. I'm back into the book of Job. I know too many good people who are suffering and too many bad people who are rewarded. I walk out on the beach now.
You're mugged first.
I look up into that starry sky, and rather than feel inflated by what I see, I am diminished by what I see, because the staircase, rather than leading up to a top step bathed in light, simply goes on and on and on and on, ever moving off into who knows what or where. I look down the staircase, I don't know where I came from. You know, I look down and I'm looking into some kind of primordial swamp. Where did I come from? And if I don't know that, what is my relation to other creatures? What is my relation to animals? Maybe I am not by nature superior to them. Maybe I have a special obligation to them. Maybe I shouldn't love them so much I'll eat them. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, so I'm going to raise that species, and I'm going to take a whole different view of the earth. The river, I don't like the way that river is flowing. Or let me be even sillier. I want to live in Southern California. I want to put lots of people in Southern California. I got a problem. It's a desert. I got to get water in there, you know? So I'm going to go to Arizona for my water, and I'm going to move the water. It's not nice to fool with Mother Nature. Remember that commercial? Yeah. It's a very different world. This is just to illustrate the difference between Dante's world and ours. What's going to happen, of course, to Dante's world in just a few centuries, in a very brief time, is that notion of the Ptolemaic universe is going to go boom, because the Copernican universe is going to replace it. Galileo is going to get thrown into jail for suggesting that the Earth is not the center of the universe at all. We got it wrong. The sun is not rising and setting. It's we who are going around the sun. And that's a radical notion. Boy, is that a different notion. And the notion of the body politic, the ordered state, where the king is the head of state, of the body politic. And the king is God's representative, right? So as God rules the cosmos, the king rules the state, the head rules the body, right? And then along's going to come Machiavelli, and we're going to discover, whoops, it doesn't quite work that way. So the state gets tossed off. You know, the ordered state gets disrupted. And then we're going to have that wonderful notion that we've inherited from the Greeks, that we are rational animals, right? The thing that separates us from the animals. And what is it that we more and more discover is that we're a hell of a lot more animal than we are rational. Yeah. And what happens, these are very disturbing concepts in the history of ideas. These are really disruptive concepts. And no surprise that here we are at the latter part of the 20th century, still in the age of anxiety, still trying to come to grips with some sense of these questions. How should the state be ordered? Well, it wasn't too long ago that there was a theory that said, you know, that let the power be in the hands of the workers, you know, and we would have the workers' paradise and all that sort of stuff. And geez, it sounded great in theory. And then it just started collapsing left and right because it didn't take into effect human nature. We're still wrestling with what the state should look like, what the cosmos should look like, but most importantly for us, it seems to me, is what we should look like, what we should hold. And so, boy, is that a long-winded, I apologize for this speech, but that's a long-winded response to your question. Yeah, it was much easier, wasn't it, when you could just go, let's see, what sin is that? And you got your ledger book out, and you went, well, that's, you know, and if I die with that on my soul, oh boy, so I better, you know, yeah. Is it worth it? Yeah. It became a kind of screwy notion. It's going to offend some people, but it really was like making sure you had clean underwear on in case you have an accident. You know that old joke. But make sure your soul is pure at all times, because you don't know when you're going to die, and you don't want to die. That was the old Catholic notion, and you do not want to die with this stuff on your soul, because this is where you'll go. You need to repent it in life. It's too late afterwards. So you need to recognize, and this is the challenge I think for all of us, is the need to recognize the dark wood. And would that it were so easy, huh? A lot of people spend an awful lot of energy not seeing the dark wood, right? They're not in a dark wood. I'm not in a dark wood. You know, the rest of the world's in a dark wood. I'm not in a dark wood. You know, that sort of thing. And Dante, of course, doesn't make it easy, because even when Dante recognizes he's in a dark wood and is motivated to get out of the dark wood, what should pop up to block his path but three rather frightening beasts? Yeah. And he has got to get past those beasts. Dante does not suggest that this is easy. In fact, he suggests quite the contrary, that this is a very painful journey.
Could you just mention his association with Virgil?
Yeah.
I mean, he was the master to him, and he was the learner. And could you just speak to that?
No, I can't, because I'm out of time. I've just been told I have 15 seconds. Yes, Virgil as human reason can lead him on the path to goodness, but only on the path. Virgil.